the American judicial system is that sometimes the rights enumerated in the U.S. Constitution are seen as inviolable, sacred rights that are afforded to all U.S. citizens. However, at other times, those same rights are treated more as privileges, things that the government can take away from you if, according to them, you don't behave properly. I mean, at the very extreme end, the government can take your life if you commit a capital offense or if you try to move your family to a cabin over in Idaho. However, getting back to the topic of today's discussion, the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution says, and I quote, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." That is very straightforward. However, for anyone convicted of a felony or for anyone sentenced to over a year in prison, they'd actually been stripped away of their Second Amendment privileges, regardless of whether the crime they committed was violent or nonviolent. Which brings us neatly along to the case of Mr. Steven Duarte. You see, Mr. Duarte was previously a convicted criminal having 5 prior nonviolent criminal convictions on his record, with each one of those being punishable by over a year in prison. The crimes, they included things like vandalism, possession of a controlled substance, evading police, and so on. And Mr. Duarte had already served out his prison time. But the fact that his crimes were nonviolent doesn't really matter, because according to the letter of the law, specifically according to the federal felon in possession law, a person cannot possess a firearm if they were previously convicted of a, quote, crime punishable by imprisonment for a term exceeding 1 year. Mr. Duarte was convicted for longer than a year, and therefore he was not allowed to own a gun. However, fast forward to March of 2020, and Mr. Duarte was sitting in the back of a car that happened to run a stop sign. The cops saw the car, they turned their sirens on, and began to try to get the car to pull over. During this interim period, Mr. Duarte was seen tossing a gun out of his window. He, of course, wasn't allowed to own a handgun, and therefore, after several months, a jury sentenced him to over 4 years in prison. But Mr. Duarte appealed that decision to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, who just earlier this month ruled in his favor. Quote, "In a decision that could have a major impact on the exercise of Second Amendment rights, a split Ninth Circuit panel has ruled that convicted felons can own guns, at least when it comes to nonviolent offenders who have re-entered society. In a 2-1 decision handed down on May the 9th, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that Mr. Duarte's conviction violated the Second Amendment as applied to him. Specifically, the court's majority found that the federal government failed to prove that its felon in possession law supports disarming convicted felons for life under a 2-step framework established by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 2022 New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruen case." Now, just to pause here for a quick moment, and without getting into too much of the weeds, the U.S. Supreme Court case that's referenced here, the Bruen case, it really upended a lot of gun restrictions here in America. Essentially, what the Bruen decision did is that it set up a new test that courts across America have to apply when deciding whether or not a certain anti-gun law violates the U.S. Constitution. Here was the relevant part in the majority opinion of the Bruen case, and the majority opinion, for your reference, was written by Justice Clarence Thomas. Quote, "The burden falls on the defendants to show that New York's proper cause requirement is consistent with this nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Constitutional rights are enshrined with the scope they were understood to have when the people adopted them. With these principles in mind, the court concludes that respondents have failed to meet their burden to identify an American tradition justifying New York's proper by far known to be the most liberal in the entire justice system. Secondly, the Ninth Circuit, it covers the western states as well as Hawaii and Alaska, which together represent about 80 million people. And given that 8% of the U.S. are felons, and then furthermore, many more people have been convicted of misdemeanors that carry at least a year in prison, well, this new ruling from the Ninth Circuit, it opens the door to quite literally millions of potential new legal gun owners. Although eventually, either this case or a case like it will likely reach the U.S. Supreme Court so that a blanket rule can be made across the entirety of the U.S. In fact, that was the sentiment shared by one of the dissenting judges in the Ninth Circuit, who wrote the following in a dissenting opinion. Quote, "One day, likely sooner rather than later, the U.S. Supreme Court will address the constitutionality of the federal felon firearm ban or otherwise provide clearer guidance on whether felons are protected by the Second Amendment." And so that is where the situation currently stands. As a practical matter, moving forward, if you happen to live in a state covered by either the Ninth or the Third Circuit Court of Appeal, and if you happen to have served at least a year in prison before, well, you might now once again be eligible to own a firearm. If you'd like to read the full decision from the Ninth Circuit for yourself, I'll throw a link to the PDF version of it down in the description box below. Oh, and actually, I'd love to know your thoughts. Do you think that this is a good development? I mean, very famously, Justice Sam Alito a few years ago, he wrote in a separate case that, quote, "The federal statute barring felons from possessing firearms probably does more to combat gun violence than any other federal law. Do you agree? And if you do you agree that a blanket ban is the way to go? Is that a good idea? Or should there be more of a distinction between violent or non-violent offenders? Or perhaps a third option, are you a Second Amendment absolutist, and do you believe that shall not infringe is as clear as day, regardless of your previous conviction history? Until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times.